Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
If you ever want to watch a family peel like old wallpaper in one long strip, ask your father to make a toast at your birthday dinner and then give him an audience that includes your boss. Because as soon as my dad stood under the warm restaurant bulbs with his glass raised and that salesman grin he puts on when there is an opportunity to score points at my expense, he said, in a voice that carried cleanly over the clatter of cutlery and the soft piano loop, that we all knew my sister was the real success in the family, and in that instant the room shifted the way a boat tips when everyone moves to one side to see a dolphin, and my mother stared hard at her water, and Natalie pressed her shoulder blades back like a pageant queen trying to look humble. And I arranged my face into that careful expression you practice when you have sat through this routine, since you were a kid building science fair boards while the other kid learned how to arrive late with perfect hair and perfect excuses. Darren, who in the office passes for charming because he hires quickly, fires slowly, and sprinkles humor over hard truths like powdered sugar over a burnt pancake, leaned in from the next table where he had camped much longer than the polite pop-in he promised, and, with a chuckle that he thought would read as light but landed like a knife wrapped in napkin, said that it was funny because she had just asked him for a job. And the silence that followed had the texture of a pulled rubber band, thin and dangerous and waiting for a snap, while the waiter froze 2 steps from my shoulder with a cake that wanted to be an event, but suddenly felt like evidence. And Natalie's face went the gray of unbaked dough as her eyes slid toward me with that private message she has sent me our whole lives, the one that says fix this. I took a long breath that tasted like lemon and butter, and instead of answering the joke or rescuing the moment or helping my father climb down from the branch he had sawed himself onto, I raised my own glass and said that I was grateful for the company and for the chance to celebrate not just birthdays but the truth, and the table laughed, because when a woman says truth at a dinner in a soft voice everyone assumes she means something sentimental. And in that cover of polite noise I slipped my phone from my bag, opened the internal referral portal our legal team insists we use for any friend of the company introduction, and typed Natalie's full name and email with the kind of precision you earn after years of doing the work people think just happens by magic, then toggled the box labeled disclosure to hiring manager and entered Darren's address, which would route an automatic compliance packet that requires candidates to upload samples, disclose prior client conflicts, and sign a statement about outside help used in application materials, all friendly, all standard, all invisible until it is not, because nothing says happy birthday like a paper trail. The cake landed then, a ridiculous white mountain with too many candles melting into shining beads that crawled over the frosting, and people started singing in that embarrassed, stumbling way adults sing when they are not certain the person of honor actually wants to hear it, and I closed my eyes to make a wish while thinking of the first time I realized that wishes work better when they are attached to actions, and when I blew, I did it slowly enough that the smoke rose in a calm little storm. That gave me time to lean toward Natalie and say that if she wanted feedback on her resume I could help her polish it before Monday, because nothing calms a skittish horse like a gentle hand, and nothing exposes a lazy rider like a shallow jump. She smiled with a stretch of lips that did not touch her eyes and said she had it handled because her brand spoke for itself, which would have been adorable if it were not a sentence built from helium, and Dad, riding his own high, announced that since we were all here we should compare achievements, which is a game he likes to play because scorekeeping helps him pretend he is coaching a championship team rather than refereeing a league he barely understands, and I nodded and let him run the scoreboard while I texted our HR partner a brief note that I had sent a referral through the official channel and, per policy, wanted the standard blind skills exercise ready to go. Nothing tailored, nothing cruel. Just the same fair test we give to contractors who claim they can do the work at the level our clients expect, a sequence that looks like kindness because it is, and looks like steel because it is that too. People started eating cake and picking at berries and telling stories that left out the parts that would make them look small, and Darren leaned closer, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to gossip, but I gave him a steady look that said we would talk at work, not here. "Not tonight," and he backed off into his glass the way managers do when they realize the employee they underestimated can carry a silence like a blade. And while my mother fussed with the bill because fussing is her way to patch any leak, I caught sight of my reflection in the restaurant's brass sconce and thought how strange it is that the moment you stop performing the role your family assigned you, they panic as if you replaced the furniture in the dark. By the time the plates cleared, the referral system had already pinged my inbox with its polite confirmation and sent the first packet to Natalie's email, which meant that the choice to be who she says she is no longer lived in speeches, but in files and dates and signatures. And as coats were passed and hugs distributed like party favors, my phone buzzed again with a message from my mother sent from the restaurant bathroom, which she uses as a confessional when the main sanctuary becomes too bright, asking me, in a line that looked like a prayer and a threat and a plea all at once, to please not ruin Natalie's shot because it would crush her father if this got messy. And as I stared at those words, I remembered every time I had been told to carry the secret so the family would not have to carry the truth, and I smiled in a way that does not photograph and typed back that I would never ruin something real, then slid the phone away and stepped into the night air where the city smelled like rain and warm bread, while far behind me a new email began its slow, neutral walk toward my sister's inbox, and with it the first quiet piece of revenge not loud enough to be called a fight yet sharp enough to draw a line. As a second buzz lit my screen with a notification from Darren that simply read "We should talk Monday," and a third buzz, colder than the others, flashed from an unknown number with a subject line that made my stomach tighten so quickly it felt like a pulled muscle. Ethics concern regarding your involvement in candidate selection. Morning arrived with a taste of old buttercream and the kind of headache that comes not from wine but from restraint, and while the city dragged its gray sleeves over the skyline, I sat at my kitchen table with the ethics complaint open on my laptop, reading the anonymous phrasing that dressed accusation as concern, noting how it painted me as a puppeteer nudging a hiring process toward family advantage, even though everything I had done lived inside policy and sunlight, and yet I still felt that hot spike of schoolgirl shame because anonymous voices always know where to stab, especially when they echo words you once believed about yourself. I brewed coffee I did not really want and scrolled the complaint again to catch its tells, the way a poker player watches a throat, and noticed how the writer used the same odd hyphenation Darren favors in memos and the same half-joking parenthetical Natalie slips into captions when she wants to seem self-deprecating without surrendering an inch, which might have been coincidence. Except coincidence rarely arrives with a timestamp that matches the hour my mother disappeared into the restaurant bathroom to send her warning text, and as I held those details together it felt like pressing two thin wires that hum when they touch, a small current that did not prove anything in court but told me enough to move. The policy path was straightforward, so I took it. I forwarded the complaint to HR with a neutral note requesting an independent reviewer and a hold on my involvement in any step tied to my sister. And then I asked for a copy of the fairness checklist we use when a potential conflict appears, because nothing cleans a stain like documented process, and while I waited for the acknowledgement receipt that would timestamp my spine into place, I opened a blank doc and built what looked like a friendly guide for external applicants, a simple walkthrough of the blind skills exercise with tips on formatting, resources, and expectations, and beneath that, without a hint of sarcasm, I added a paragraph about the kind of collaboration we do, the way we cite sources, and how we treat borrowed language, all in a tone so patient a scout leader would have applauded. Then I published it to the company blog where anyone could access it, which meant that when the packet hit Natalie's inbox she would receive the same map as every other applicant, and if she wandered off trail it would be a choice, not an ambush. My mother called as the post went live, her voice sugar-thin and trembly in the way that always makes me feel 12 again, telling me that last night had spooked my father because he hates surprises unless he is the one delivering them. Asking me if there was any way to call Darren and smooth things over, maybe ask him to ignore any emails he might see, and I listened without promising, asking instead how Natalie was handling it, to which Mom said she was fine, then breathed into the receiver. in a way that said fine meant curled on a couch with a blanket and a phone and an audience, and before I could push, she dropped a stray confession like a coin at the wrong register, mentioning that she had only called Darren because she wanted to make sure the dinner didn't get awkward and that he had reassured her he would keep things light. At which point my heart slid a centimeter south because it meant my boss had entered our family theater days before the curtain rose, and maybe he had enjoyed his seat enough to test his lines. At noon, HR replied with the measured cadence of professionals who have seen every flavor of mess, confirming the recusal and attaching the checklist, which I printed and pinned beside my monitor as a small act of ceremony. And then, as if choreographed by an impatient playwright, an email from Natalie arrived asking for my advice on the blind test, using my old nickname that tastes like chlorine and summers and blackmail, claiming she only wanted to be sure her submission reflected the company's culture, and I typed a very restrained response that linked her to the public guide and reminded her that per fairness rules we could not discuss specifics. Then hit send before the part of me that loves to fix things could wrestle the keyboard and ruin us both. Because I had spent a childhood watching her turn group projects into solo recitals, I anticipated the next move before it happened, so I built a sandbox. A duplicate of the test environment with a subtle watermark embedded in the metadata and a handful of harmless decoy assets whose file names contained traceable microtypos. And I uploaded the package under a general resource link where anyone on the internet could pull it, then mentioned it in a general forum populated by freelancers who often circle our postings like gulls over a boardwalk, and by late afternoon the link began to travel on little shoes, and my dashboard recorded 2 anonymous downloads within minutes of each other. One from a coffee shop near Natalie's apartment and one from a co-working space I knew her friend Simone uses when the home background does not look aspirational enough for Instagram. A pattern that did not thrill me but did comfort the part of my brain that believes in receipts the way other people believe in miracles. As the sun dragged itself through the blinds, a Slack message popped from Darren with a breezy opener that smelled like Febreze sprayed in a locker room, proposing that we grab 5 minutes before the staff meeting to discuss the noise around last night, which I agreed to because letting a story congeal without you is how you end up starring in a version you do not recognize. And at 4:30 we stood at the end of the hallway by the vending machine pretending to be 2 adults discussing logistics while he fidgeted with a dollar bill and suggested that I might want to stay hands-off on any public channels for a few days so optics didn't bite us, to which I said optics usually behave when truth wears clean shoes. And he laughed like I was charming and not dangerous, a misread I tucked away for later. When the test window opened the next morning, submissions trickled in with the usual mix of careful and chaotic, and among them arrived a package tagged to Natalie's candidate ID, zipped neatly and titled with a confidence that made my shoulders tense. And as the reviewer opened it on a screen I could not see, I watched a different monitor that displayed only the metadata log, waiting for the watermark to either stay invisible, which would have been fine, or blink in a pattern that matched the decoy assets, which would be catastrophic in a way I could not protect her from, and the log lit up with a sequence that confirmed 3 borrowed fragments plus a rewritten paragraph that still carried our decoy's distinctive punctuation scar, and I did not cheer. Because you do not cheer when the door you warn someone away from swings shut on their fingers. You simply make sure the first aid kit is stocked and the incident report has no adjectives. I closed my laptop slowly, packed it into my bag with the checklist and the printed complaint and the string of texts I refused to reread, and headed toward the elevator rehearsing the measured sentences I would use when HR asked for context. When my father called to accuse me of jealousy, when Natalie sent the message that always comes after the fall, yet before I reached the lobby my phone buzzed with a new notification, and this time it was not HR or my mother or Darren but an internal alert, flagging an external IP that had accessed the sandbox link using credentials tied to a manager-level account, which meant that someone inside had quietly propped the window open for my sister. And as the elevator doors closed I saw my own reflection floating in the metal panel, calm and pale and a little fierce, and I understood that the next revenge would not be gentle or decorative or deniable, because it would require proving that the favor Natalie asked for had been granted by someone who knew better and who might, depending on how this next conversation went, be the same man who had laughed over cake while pretending he was only being funny. The following week unspoled in a rhythm that looked ordinary to anyone on the outside, but felt jagged underneath, because every routine meeting, every hallway nod, every Slack ping carried the weight of knowledge I could not voice out loud, and in that silence the air thickened, as though my office badge had become a leash tethering me to secrets. Rumors about a departmental reorganization began leaking through the building like water under a locked door. Whispers that positions would collapse into each other, that promotions already hinted at might evaporate under new charts. And with every whisper my name hovered, sometimes attached to opportunity, sometimes to risk, and always to speculation, which is worse than either, because speculation spreads faster than truth and sticks longer than fact. Knowing how fast shadows stretch, I decided to run my own test. I prepared a simple internal document, bland in subject, a summary of resource allocations for a small project no one outside our team cared about, but I seeded it with a deliberate mistake, a single typo in a file name. A minor change that could only originate from this document, like a fingerprint no one else could forge. I shared it with precisely one recipient, a manager who had recently positioned himself as Natalie's mentor, a man who wore guidance like cologne, heavy and noticeable, more about signaling than substance. The next morning, the very same typo appeared in a different thread, floating in a conversation where it did not belong, a breadcrumb that revealed itself without me needing to say a word. It meant what I suspected. Someone was funneling information outward, probably to Natalie, maybe to others, and doing it with the confidence of a person who thought their trail dissolved behind them. I forwarded the evidence, not with outrage, but with the kind of calm precision that unsettles people more than anger, attaching only the original file, the distribution list, and the external appearance of the typo, no commentary, no adjectives. A day later, the manager who had been so eager to mentor others was suddenly quieter in meetings, his smile a little tighter, as though the air had thinned around him and he could not quite pull in a full breath. I did not gloat, because small victories in corporate spaces are like temporary tattoos, satisfying in the mirror, invisible under the right sleeve, easily dismissed unless reapplied. That afternoon Darren asked me to step into his office, his tone the polished casual of a man who knows the walls are thin. He gestured toward a chair, leaned back with a smirk that was supposed to reassure, but mostly looked rehearsed, and told me I was the frontrunner for the promotion if nothing messy landed on his desk in the next month. He let the phrase hang there, nothing messy, like a condition carved into stone, before pausing just long enough to make me wonder if silence would cover his real intent. Then he added, with deliberate weight, that my mother had called him, apparently days before the dinner, asking if he would go easy on Natalie should her resume appear, because she was nervous about optics. I sat there, hands folded, not flinching, though inside I felt the same cold drop you get when the roller coaster clicks up a chain, and you realize you have no choice but to go down. He studied me, waiting for denial or confession, maybe both, but I offered neither, simply asked whether he had reassured her. He admitted that he had, claiming he thought it was harmless, just family nerves. I thanked him with a smile so tight it could have cut glass, excused myself, and returned to my desk with the awareness that the walls I had trusted to separate my work from my family had been deliberately dismantled, plank by plank, until even my boss knew more about my sister's ambitions than I wanted to know myself. That night, staring at the ceiling in the dim light of my apartment, I wondered how many calls my mother had made over the years, how many invisible arrangements had been smoothed without my knowledge, and whether I had been the only one laboring under the illusion that merit mattered. The realization was both sharp and dull, sharp in its betrayal, dull in its familiarity, because somewhere in my bones I had always known. When I finally closed my eyes, I thought about Darren's warning, about the word messy, about the ethics complaint that had appeared like a thief in the night, and I understood that none of this was accidental. It was choreography, and I was expected to miss a step. What none of them understood was that I had learned long ago how to dance with knives. And as my phone lit up one more time with a calendar reminder I did not remember creating months old, titled Only Birthday Dinner Seating Plan, with Darren's name in the guest list, I realized that perhaps the stage had been set even before I noticed the lights, and that someone, maybe me, maybe not, had pulled strings far earlier than the night the candles melted into my cake. The company fundraiser had never mattered much to me in previous years. It was one of those glossy calendar events that floated above real work like decorative foam on weak coffee, mostly useful for schmoozing with people who called themselves thought leaders, and for giving upper management a reason to send marketing interns into spirals over linen colors and dessert platters. But this year, I saw it differently, because this year, it became a stage, not for a performance, but for precision, a carefully lit space where I could turn subtext into spectacle without saying a single name or raising my voice even once. In the week leading up to the event, I curated a segment highlighting innovative team solutions under budget constraints, a phrase so bland on the surface it practically begged people to skip it, which meant only the observant would linger long enough to notice that the showcase solution, our internal audit automation flow, was the exact project Natalie had been circling in her communications, dressing it up as something she had contributed to during research, a claim so vague it could almost pass, unless one were to compare timestamps, source logs, or, in this case, screen captures showing which accounts created the original architecture and when. The presentation, which I deliberately did not deliver myself, flowed through a curated demo featuring actual workflow footage, annotated by our junior engineer, Aaron, a quiet genius who deserved more spotlight anyway. And I made sure the team's names appeared on every slide, not in fine print, but in bold font, side by side, with commit logs and real-time interface footage in the background, so that every claim could be traced, every action verified, and every audience member could feel the weight of honest, traceable labor wrapped in simplicity. I watched from the back of the room as Erin clicked through the slides, her voice steady, her posture confident, and I noted the subtle shift in posture from the front row, shoulders straightening, brows furrowing. People beginning to pay attention not to the buzzwords, but to the infrastructure, to the solidity beneath the surface, and I caught the moment when Natalie, seated 3 chairs down from Darren, glanced sideways. Her expression locked somewhere between confusion and calculation, because it was becoming clear that the project she had claimed adjacent glory for was being owned, publicly and completely, by people she had never bothered to acknowledge. After the applause, which was modest but sincere, the room shifted back to its usual rhythm of drinks and networking chatter, but the damage was done, and not because anyone shouted or accused or revealed, but because the narrative she had been building, that she was already partially integrated, already valuable, already in, had unraveled not by force, but by the quiet, undeniable weight of evidence placed gently in full view. I found Darren by the bar, his glass half full, his smile performing balance, and before he could speak I said, with no particular heat, that I hoped the clarity of ownership came through today, because in moments like these, reputation tends to crystallize quickly, and he nodded, a little too slowly, as though recalibrating a story he thought he understood, and then he asked if we could meet next week to discuss the path forward, which was his favorite phrase for navigating storms without admitting who had stirred the clouds. I did not answer right away, because just then my father appeared across the room, cutting through the crowd with the stilted motion of a man trying to look like he belonged somewhere he had only visited in stories, and when he reached me, there was no toast in his hand, no smirk on his face, just a strange stillness in his eyes as he asked to speak outside for a minute, his tone lacking the usual bravado, like a man approaching a house he used to own but no longer has the keys to. On the sidewalk, beneath the brittle autumn sky, he started talking in loops, first about the fundraiser, then about how proud he was to see me in command, and then, without warning, he dropped the line like a stone into water, that he had used my college fund years ago to help Natalie out of a rough patch, that he thought she would bounce back faster, that he always figured I'd be fine no matter what, and that maybe it had been unfair, but that fairness and family didn't always walk the same road. I listened without interruption, not because I was calm, but because when the truth finally arrives after years of guessing, it doesn't scream, it whispers, and the only thing louder than the words is the silence that follows them. I didn't ask for the amount. I didn't ask whether Mom knew. I just let him finish, nodded once, and stepped back into the building, where light and chatter tried to reclaim me, but couldn't quite reach. Later that night, I sat on my couch with the sliding glass door open to let in the cold, holding my phone and staring at the calendar invite that still sat unanswered. Birthday dinner seating plan, created months ago, sent from my account, with Darren's name tagged. And I knew without doubt that I had not made that invite, that someone had spoofed it or accessed my calendar while I was logged in, probably on a shared screen or in one of those moments where trust disguised itself as routine, and I realized with sudden, sharp clarity that I wasn't just reacting to a storm. I had been placed at its center, possibly long before the first drop ever fell. And in that realization, I understood something else. The final play wouldn't be about revenge anymore. It would be about extraction. Not from the company, not from the family, but from the version of myself who kept stitching things back together just so other people could keep breaking them. The next move wouldn't be loud, but it would be the last one they didn't see coming. I arrived at the office early on Monday, not out of nervousness or ambition, but with the deliberate calm of someone who had already crossed the emotional finish line and was now simply cleaning up the course. The air in the building still carried the stale scent of weekend air conditioning and leftover donuts from some intern's forgotten birthday, and as I walked the hallway toward my desk, I passed familiar faces who nodded without knowing that this would be the last time they'd ever see me in this light, in this role, at this particular angle of performance. I had already packed my intentions into separate boxes, not physical ones, but mental, strategic containers marked with names like closure, exposure, and, most importantly, freedom. Darren had scheduled a meeting with me for 9 a.m. sharp, and as I stepped into the glass conference room where the morning sun cut clean rectangles across the table, I noticed his posture had shifted. He looked too relaxed, like someone who had either made a decision or rehearsed a lie enough times to believe it. He offered the kind of smile that managers save for post-storm briefings, a mix of weary optimism and thinly veiled self-interest, and he began by saying that the company had reviewed the complaint, that my recusal had been noted and appreciated, and that, technically, nothing had been mishandled. Yet he stressed the word technically in a way that suggested I was being handed a gentle nudge toward silence rather than a genuine acknowledgement of procedural clarity. He pivoted, of course, as men like him do, toward the language of corporate resilience, phrases like moving forward, optics, shared outcomes, and finally, he asked what my goals were, not just for the role, but for my future here. As if pretending the past few weeks hadn't rendered the present unbearable. I waited until he finished rearranging his coffee cup 3 separate times on the coaster before I answered, not with rage or indignation, but with surgical stillness. I told him my goals had changed. I said I wanted to make space for people who did the work without the safety net of legacy favors and hallway deals whispered into Bluetooth headsets during Sunday golf games. I said I no longer believed in staying quiet just because the room preferred noise. Then I pulled out the envelope I had brought with me, yes, a physical envelope, because some things deserve to be handed over with weight, and slid it across the table. Inside was a printout, not of emails, not of logs, but of a personal letter written by Natalie 3 weeks ago, addressed to Darren, never sent, but recovered because she left her Gmail open on my mother's laptop during one of her visits. And my mother, perhaps out of guilt or desperation or some maternal impulse corrupted by years of selective loyalty, forwarded it to me without a word. The letter was a mixture of flattery and subtle threats, a performance of innocence with just enough barbed wire beneath the surface to show her intent. She wanted the job. She believed it was hers. And she reminded Darren of their shared connections from an old nonprofit gala where photos still lived online, tagged with smiling faces and champagne flutes. Darren scanned the first paragraph, then the second, and by the third his jaw tensed in that familiar way, the muscle pulsing just enough to betray him, because even if he hadn't done anything explicitly actionable, The implication alone could stain him in ways no internal review could clean. I told him I wasn't interested in escalation. I wasn't threatening him. I simply wanted the truth to exist somewhere other than in my own head, and now it did. He asked what I planned to do next, and I said I planned to decline the promotion if offered, not out of wounded pride, but because I had outgrown the version of myself who thought titles were shields. That afternoon, I wrote my resignation letter, not as a manifesto, not as a parting shot, but as a quiet record of what happens when a person who has always been expected to make things easier decides instead to make things true. I didn't send it immediately. First, I sent Natalie one final message. It contained no insults, no accusations, no references to dinners or cake or job packets. I simply told her I hoped, when she did land something eventually, that it would be because she could do it, not because someone had made the space for her by erasing someone else. She didn't reply, at least not directly. But that evening, an automatic notification hit my inbox, showing that her application portal account had been deactivated. No explanation, just a quiet exit, the same way she had always expected others to clear the stage when her part was over. The final text came from my father. It was short, half apology, half warning, saying that families go through rough seasons, but they find their way back to each other, and that maybe we'd all laugh about this someday. I didn't respond, because not every ending needs to be tied up with a moral or a reconciliation. Some endings simply ask you to walk away without turning around, and that's what I did. I walked out of the office with my bag slung over one shoulder, the lobby lights casting long reflections across the polished floor, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of expectations slide off me like a coat I no longer needed to wear. And somewhere, just past the parking lot, a version of myself who used to wait for permission finally decided to move without asking.